Thank you, Jeannie. That was beautiful. Thank you. Well, after Linda asked me to do the message, I realized I needed to come up with it. And so when I approached her with the title I wanted to use of God, You Got This, she said, "Is it end with a question mark?" I thought, well, I hadn't really thought about that. So let's talk about punctuation. As an engineer, I can assure you this is going to be a very short lesson. So this morning, why don't we consider, as we turn things over to God, to not question it and end it with a question mark, but instead punctuate it with a period. And then I needed to figure out what I was going to talk about. And I thought, was it going to be a message of releasing and getting rid of anxiety and worry and fear, or maybe a message of surrender and faith and trust, or maybe a message of comfort and healing, or even prosperity and hope. And it was then that I realized that when we turn things over to God, it's all of those things and more. Now, many of you know that I'm a firm believer in prayer. I've been involved with the prayer team for many, many years, and I truly believe that we can connect with God through prayer, and that God is always there for us and wants to be a part of our lives. I shared this with you before, but one of the things that my wife Sandy does, at the beginning of a new year, instead of coming up with a long list of detailed resolutions for her and for me, came up with a single word. And we would use that as a guiding light throughout the entire year. Now, I've adopted that same principle for our company, and we've done it for several years. And in this current year, in 2015, our word is, well, actually it's two words, is to be God-centered. And we try to integrate that with everything we do, with all the decisions and the goals that we make. And we use it kind of as a touchstone with the communications that we have with people both inside and outside of our office. Well, there's something happened at the beginning of the year, actually in February. Someone came up to me in the office and said, a lot of the projects that we're working on are finishing up. They're about done. We're going to have enough work. Now, I kind of already knew that, but it quickly threw me back to recalling 2008 when we didn't have enough work. And it was tough. Times were tough. And it wasn't much fun at all. But then I asked her, I said, what's our word for the year? And she said, well, to be God-centered. I said, well, let's assume that God already understands all of that and what we need. The very next day, we got 5 new projects. So obviously God knew what we needed and had it under control. And we've had more opportunities since then, and we've been busier now than we've ever been before. Something else occurred around that same time, actually a little bit before that. Linda McCoy here announced that she was going to be retiring from the garden, which is a great thing for her and her family and the rest of the world, but it's kind of tough for the rest of us here. And that very Sunday, somebody came up to me and said, Rob, don't let the garden die. And that thought never really crossed my mind. And then as we began transition talks with the governing board at St. Luke's and the garden leadership team, everybody was wrestling with what would be best for the garden after Linda. And I continued to tell people to pray for the decisions that are being made by St. Luke's and the garden. And then the leadership team in the garden decided to follow another course of being not connected with St. Luke's. And then it was decided what are we going to do with that? And I felt with that decision, it took on a whole new dimension. There were a myriad of things that were going to have to be addressed that wouldn't have had to be otherwise. And then it was decided to let everyone here at the garden to express their views with a survey on that. And as the results were tallied, the results weren't really what I expected, and frankly, not at all what I wanted. But people then asked me, what are we going to do? What's going to happen now? And I said, continue to pray for the garden. And I said, don't worry, because God's got this. And that's exactly what I did. I continued to pray that God would help the garden not only survive, but to thrive during this future in the coming years. I was reminded of a Bible passage in the 5th chapter of Job where it tells us that, now as for me, I would seek God if I were you. I would commit my case to God. And that's exactly what I did. And then we learned that the Reverend Carolyn Scanlon Holmes was going to be the new pastor here at the garden. Now, Carolyn is a woman with unbelievable energy and a strong faith and a history with St. Luke's. And it was then that I'm convinced now that God's got this more than ever. Well, since we're talking about former pastors at St. Luke's, the former senior pastor is Kent Millard. And Kent and I are on a charter school board together, and we had some things to talk about. And when he was in town, we had lunch, and we talked about the garden, and I asked him for some help with this message coming up, and asked him about things going on in his family and life. And I asked Kent, is there ever a time that you felt there's a Bible scripture that really spoke to you, or you were being directed by God? And he immediately came up and said, well, yeah, when I was asked to come to Indianapolis. Apparently when the bishop talked with him and provided the opportunity to come to Indianapolis, he made a list of pros and cons and reflected on the Bible passage that told of a time in Luke when Jesus was meeting with his disciples and had just broken bread with them and had wine and told them that he was going to be betrayed and captured and arrested and killed. Pretty well bummed everybody out. Jesus left the group and prayed to God, if you're willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but your will be done. Yet not my will, but your will be done. These are the words that Kent continued to keep in his mind. And as he made his list of pros and cons, there's a long list of cons and a couple in the pros. I mean, here he had an opportunity to be the senior pastor of one of the largest Methodist churches in the country. But it was a long way from South Dakota, where he was raised and established. And here he was going to be following a senior pastor who was much beloved and had been there for many, many years. Does that part sound familiar? Yet Kent continued to pray about it and believe, yet not my will, but your will be done. And it was because of that decision that he came to Indianapolis, and during his tenure here, the garden began, and the garden continued to grow. And so that single decision and guidance affected not only the people at St. Luke's, the Indianapolis community, but everyone here at the garden. I can only imagine the wrestling and the sleepless nights that went on during that time, just as so many of us have, as we face obstacles and wrestle with things that we're not sure of. But it's when we can truly put our faith in that and have confidence that it's going to be better, that we can sit back and just watch God prepare our way. There's something that happened exactly 2 months ago that solidified this message in my mind that I wanted to share with you. It occurred on April 14th, a Tuesday, at 11:50 p.m. Now that Monday night, our youngest son RJ and his wife Vesna went in to have a baby. And all of our families gathered in the waiting room. We set up our little area and we waited and waited and waited and waited. And then it was Tuesday evening when we learned that the baby was under stress, that Vesna's temperature was over 102 and the baby's heart rate was over 200, and there were complications. Well, we sat there not knowing what was going on. And then RJ came out with a real look of concern on his face and said that the NICU doctors had come in and they had Layla, that she was in NICU room number 1 and he wasn't sure how she was, but Vesna was fine. We sat there still not knowing. We gathered together, we hugged each other, we prayed. We prayed, God, you got this. Please. As we continued to wait, we later learned that there was a concern over infection and some other things. And during that 2 hours, we continued to pray. And it was after that time we got to see her. We found out that she was still doing okay. We couldn't hold her, but she looked beautiful. As the week went on, she continued to stay healthy. The test results kept coming back better and better. It was towards the end of the week that one of the NICU nurses said that she was the healthiest baby there in the NICU. Not to mention the cutest, and the smartest, and the most athletic, and compassionate baby in the NICU. But nonetheless, And it was late that Friday afternoon that they got to go home. And they were all here at the first service and are doing great. And it was again at that time when I realized I had reached out to God and had a response, but it wasn't quick enough. As I say that, I remember something that Ken told me. He said that invariably he would pray in the morning to God to take all of his concerns for the day. And here's a pastor doing this. And then by 11 o'clock in the morning, he would have taken them all back and have to talk to God again. Why is it that we doubt? Why is it that we doubt God and feel that we have to take all of these things on? I realize with all the things that happen in my life, I really ought to know better. But there are times in my life when I've talked to God and it doesn't go that way and I'm going, really? But it's also during those times that I've hesitated and been blind to watching the things that God is doing. And I may have missed something that I could have done that would have made the situation better. And that's all we have to do, is look at those things and to have trust and patience. At the beginning of the service, I mentioned, is this going to be a message of letting go of worry, anxiety, and fear? Or a message of surrender and trust and faith? Or healing and comfort, or hope and prosperity? I forgot to mention patience. Because it's when we're patient that we can truly hear and feel and see God working in our lives. That as we do this with faith and trust and patience, it's an exciting time. Just as the Bible scripture for today that Doug mentioned, that tells us that anyone who calls out, "Help, God," will be helped. And so as we turn to God in times of need and yell out those words, "God, you got this," end it with a period or even an exclamation point.